Alright, welcome guys. So I just wanted to do a quick refresher on easy armor creation, right? If you have created your character already, I just wanted to review this method that we used in class. The gist of it is that you duplicate your model by just holding Control and hitting D for dog or D for duplicate on the keyboard. Then that creates an exact replica of your character right in place. Then you're going to select the area that the armor is going to lay on top of um, I just used the face selection tool plus holding tab right to paint my selection. Then once you have that area selected, right, you go to the select menu at the top, go to inverse, and hit delete on your keyboard. That'll delete all of the rest of the character, but leave you with that single piece. Then in face mode, you can select those faces again and choose extrude. That will leave you with a uh, piece of geometry that perfectly fits your character's topology. Right, there won't be any overlap or things sticking inside of each other. And with that additional piece of geometry, right, then you can start to mold that weapon or that piece of armor to your needs. So you can see some of the tools. I'm just using multi-cut and bevel or insert edge loop. All of your kind of basic modeling tools can be used to create that piece of armor on top of your character that will fit them perfectly. So you still want to be careful of keeping the form true to what you would imagine your character's outfit or armor to be, right? I'm not going 100% by my underlying concept art. In this case, I'm just kind of testing out this overlap kind of roof tile shape with edge loops here. I'm splitting the edge loops with a bevel and then creating that kind of overhang look by selecting the edge loops on top and moving them out, scaling them up. And that gives me that piece of overlapping armor that I was kind of looking for. Dial down the first test run. Last step is to mirror across the x-axis to the negative in my case, which gives me a duplicate on the other side. Next thing, I'm going to look for other opportunities where a piece of armor or outfit, clothing, right, sticks out a little bit from the character, where I don't think I can really accomplish that look through bump mapping. Then I want to start to look for how I can craft those items out of a new piece of geometry. So here I'm going for his kind of elbow pad that he's got on his left arm, and just doing a quick little piece right there. Again, for stuff that's not going to be seen very often or not going to be noticed by most people, it's okay to stick with very low poly. Also, since I am rotating around my model so much, right, I do notice areas where maybe I've neglected some of the anatomy work, and if I spot little spaces where suddenly something doesn't look right, where the proportions don't quite fit what I would imagine them to be, I do try and correct those along the way, just so that I can make sure that my overall proportions and anatomy are good on the model. Next, I'm going to move on to his kind of hip armor. You can see in the front view he's got kind of these steel strips that are overlaid over his hips. So I use the same method of selecting the polys, creating a duplicate, deleting the polys that I don't need, and then using the remaining polys to create that armor. In this case, I am going to assume that I'll use a bump map to create some of the the effect on these guys, I might go back and cut them again if I feel like I still am not as high poly as I need to be. Overall, let's see, I'm sitting in my version at still under about 5,000 or 7,000 polys, which is pretty high, but not not too crazy. So I could still think about adding more geometry, but I first want to get the overall shapes in there. So I put these together quickly, assuming that I'm going to use a bump or normal map to create that overlap effect. So again, there you can see I have an extra little piece of armor on top now. The only thing that I would still think about doing for all these armor pieces is possibly deleting the inside faces. That's something I would definitely do, right, if I was working on a game character. But if I'm just working on this for an animation, and it's not a huge deal what my poly count is, right? Sometimes those internal faces won't really matter, right? They're not going to get seen, but they are technically computed by the CPU if you're in a game scene. So you don't want to get too crazy with leaving inside faces together, but if you're going to be rendering it out, it's not as big of a deal. So I'm going to go through, like I said, to just correct any anatomy work, but then create those final pieces of the character that break the silhouette, right, that kind of stick out a little bit more, like his boots. I noticed that he has kind of a strap across his chest that's going to be holding his sword, and I wanted to test out what that would look like in geometry, and I've sped this up 10x so that you guys don't have to watch me do all these cuts and merges. But in this case, this is again some piece that I might decide that I want to keep, or I might realize that I already have too much geometry, and I might go back to just having it be a part of the bump map rather than giving it a piece of geometry by itself. You can see when you use the multi-cut, it sometimes creates selection issues, so I was just having trouble selecting the whole thing. Again, the nice part of creating geometry this way is that it will keep the same pivot point as your main model. So if your model's pivot point is at 0, 0, 0, as it should be, all I needed to do to move it back into place was to hold X, which will snap it to the grid. As I move it back and it snaps to the grid, it will snap back to overlay exactly on top of the character's body. So there's the little last piece of the armor. I did a little bit more geometry on there for a kind of belt buckle, and moved around some verts just to try and reduce the complexity of that. Realized he also had a little dagger on his belt, so quickly modeled that out with an extrude, and then try to catch where it needed a little more form to it, gave it some bevels along the edges, and then rounded out the edges on that dagger, just to give him another little small weapon to be carrying there. Again, I didn't go exactly by the visual reference. You kind of have to eyeball these things and make sure that it's going to make sense for the character in their own scale. Lastly, I'm just going to add the little hand armor. Then I went back and I actually noticed some issues with the head, so I went back and changed some of the scale of the head there. But this was the last piece of armor. One last step that I'm going to do with this character is to give him a cape. In my concept art, he has got a nice flowing cape along his back here, and it is something I'd like to add on his back. So in order to create a cape, I need two things. I already have his body, which is going to act as a collider for the cape, right? Everything is going to actually lay on top of this geometry and it will collide just like you would expect something in Unity, right? Like if this was a collider object and I threw another rigid body object onto the top of his skull, it would bounce off that collider. So what I'm going to do for a demo quick is to create a plane which will act as his cape. I'm going to resize it to be about as big of a piece of cloth as I think I'll need. The only thing that's a little different about this creation than maybe what we would normally do, right, is I'm going to need a lot of subdivisions on this object. So before I start to scale it, I might actually want to use these scale options rather than the scale tool. So I need a lot of geometry on this thing because it is going to be simulating each of these vertices. So each of the little vertexes on this object will in effect have its own collider on it. And then of course being connected to all the other verts, right, each one will tell the other what kind of geometry it has between those verts, and it will start to create a cloth-like substance out of that, kind of where it's talking to each other, right? Where it's telling it, okay, I am at this point in space, and I'm connected to this vertex next to me. Therefore, I'm going to need this sort of angle on geometry. So what I'm doing here is I'm just kind of guesstimating his height. Let me just see exactly how much material I'm going to need. And you can see here it kind of wraps around his chest here. So I need it to be wide enough that it's going to also overlap on his shoulders a little bit, and tall enough to make it around the top of him. So maybe about 26 is going to be good for me. Then I want to make sure I have lots of subdivisions, obviously, like I said, for the simulation part. So what's going to happen is gravity is going to be applied to this object and it is going to fall in space and then trying to kind of collide and catch on whatever object I have set as the collider. So what I'm going to do next is cut out a portion for his head. Looks like this is about the middle here. I'll use Shift and the period key to chop out a portion there, just big enough for his head to fit through. Looks alright. Zoink, like so. So, let's see here. It looks like I might have gone a little bit too ham on that. So let's deselect maybe these first 3 or 4 rows, because I do need enough material in here to fold over, like so. I'll add one in the back. Let's see how this looks. So you can get pretty detailed with your cloth objects, but I'm just going to go for this simple cape shape. And we'll see what happens when I let it fly. So start out with the cape right there. For this, you do want a nice and long timeline. So maybe setting it up to a couple hundred frames. I'll put it at about 700 frames. If you don't have your timeline showing, that is under Windows UI Elements, time slider and range slider, right? And then you can scale how many frames you have visible using the range slider. So how this works is first I select the object that is going to be my collider. Now I've already set a rigid shape on here. You find that under this little FX tab. And you're going to tell it that this is the rigid mesh. I also want to switch to my FX menu. There, it's a little easier to see. So here's going to be my option to create a passive collider, or this second icon here in the toolbar. So then it will assign n rigid shape onto this object. Oh, I got a lot of history on that object. Probably want to get rid of that history in a moment. Let me save my scene just so that I have a backup. Then I'm going to select my cloth object. Looks symmetrical there. This is quite a plain shape, so nothing fancy. Then again, if you want to use the menus, you can use create end cloth or hit this little plus button here. It will add an end cloth shape with a bunch of different properties on it, right? And we'll add this little yellow circle. Then what I want to do is to simulate the drooping of this cloth in Gravity. And what I'm going to do is hit this little play button at the end here. And you'll see the cloth falls over the character and then grabs, the front of his neck there. Now what I want to do is hit the stop button. You'll see that I've hit about 300 frames of simulation here, right? And I'm going to try and hit the stop button when I find the cape has hit the right shape. So in my case, I'll wait for it to go all the way down, and then maybe, see, it's got some momentum there at the bottom. Maybe it'll flick back and give me a nice shape once it settles. Let's see. So I've gone all the way to 700 frames, and it looks like what has happened, right, is that the square in the middle has stretched quite a bit. But it has given me some nice clothy shapes where you can see these vertices have been bent and twisted in nice ways to give it a nice soft shape. And this would be near impossible, right, by just using our move and scale tools and things. So the issue is that if I were to call it a day and say like, okay, this is how I want my cape to look, I'm gonna fix it here in a minute because it's not quite what I want, is I would duplicate this object. I should probably name these things. And then that will maintain that shape as a piece of geometry. If I want to re-simulate and test again, all I need to do is rewind my timeline back to 0, and now I start again with this piece of cloth. So, alright, so I could start the simulation again, right, but obviously I would want to make some changes. The biggest change necessary for this one is that this hole is stretching too much at the back. And there's a really easy way to correct that. What I do is I can tell certain pieces of the cloth not to move in space, right, in Gravity. In fact, they'll be pinned down to wherever I tell them to go. So I select my area that I want to stay steady. In this case, it'll be kind of the top back. I'll assume that he has the cloth kind of pinned to his armor up here. It's a nice space for it. And I'll find a place, maybe that makes sense as well for the geometry to sit. Then what I do is I can go to the End Constraint menu and choose Transform Constraint. Right, those little dots will appear. Now, if I simulate, they will hold that area in place while the rest of the simulation runs. And falls across his back. Now, I don't always want to let it run to completion, right? Sometimes I'll see that it's hit the right shape before it runs to the end of my timeline. So do keep in mind that sometimes you just want to keep an eye on it without letting it run all the way to the end. Here, let's just see what it does if I give it that extra time to go to the end. Quite a strong fold occurring there because it is hitting his arms unexpectedly. The other thing I can notice is that now that it's pinned there, the shapes that it's forming isn't quite meeting where my artwork would appear to have it right now. Since it's not getting pulled back so far along those edges there, the neck hole is still too large, right? So I need to think about like reducing the size of that neck hole, bringing in and maybe folding over some of these pieces in the front, and overall just creating a shape that is a little bit closer to what I want my final product to be, rather than this plain Jane plane that I started with, right? So it's a good way to start from, but you can always do better, and it is worth experimenting with these tools so that you can see what kinds of results you get from these simulations. But that is the overall gist of creating a cape. The last thing to worry about, right, is that if you do have a piece like this that is very complex, is that this one cape, right, is about half as many polygons, or almost as many polygons as my entire character. So the last real step that I would go through here is to turn this into a live surface with the magnet button up here, and then to use quad draw, right, to actually draw on top of this. That way I could capture the curvature of this surface, but with a lower poly result. The other thing I would need to worry about is the internally or inside facing faces, right? These black faces on the inside of the cape will not be visible. So in order to fix that, right, I would need to extrude these faces so that I had some geometry there, and not just a single kind of zero space object, right? I would need some sort of geometry there so that this part could render, and then I would need to reverse these faces on the inside in order to get that result in the renderer. Otherwise, in game and in renderer, right, without telling the shader that I have two-sided polygons, it will only render from one side. From the other side, this cape will be almost completely invisible.